Good afternoon, everyone. I hope this finds everyone safe and well. We're really sorry for the slight delay with this webinar, but we're trying to tackle some technical problems which we're still having, but I'm confident that we will be able to tackle in the next 10 minutes. I just need to say to everyone that this session is recorded and it will be put on YouTube channel of EUMENIA Jean-Monnet network. So please keep this in mind. So thank you for joining us today for this very topical webinar actually on the EU and Syria, thinking about ways forward. This is a webinar in the framework of EUMENIA Jean-Monnet network. EUMENIA stands for EU Middle East Network in Action. And in Greek, it means goodwill and favorably disposed attitude towards someone or something. EUMENIA is a Jean-Monnet network co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union for a duration of 3 years between 2018 and 2021. It is led by myself, DIMITRIS BOURIS, Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And the network encompasses 7 more institutions, namely the University of Peloponnese, Institut Affaires Internationali, Roskilde University, Birzeit University, Yassar University, American University of Beirut, and the University of Jordan. If you would like to learn more information about EUMENIA, please like our page on Facebook and also follow us on Twitter. Now, the aim of this event today is to zoom in at the EU's role in Syria and also think about ways forward. The civil war in Syria has entered into its 10th year, but the European Union remains on its sidelines. While committed to humanitarian needs of Syrians, no reassessment of EU's policies and measures implemented on Syria in the last 10 years has been advanced by any European leaders on this ongoing war and its immediate neighborhood. This webinar takes stock of the current situation on the ground and in the region to think about meaningful approaches the EU could adopt for the future of Syria. I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished speakers for this panel, and I'll start and I'll introduce them very briefly in the order that they will speak to us. First of all, Professor YEZID SAYIGH, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Center, at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he leads the program on civil-military relations in Arab states. His work focuses on the comparative political and economic roles of Arab armed forces and non-state actors, the impact of war on states and societies, and the politics of post-conflict reconstruction and security sector transformation in Arab transitions and authoritarian resurgence. YEZID will focus on the Syrian context and the hugely challenging trends and dynamics facing the regime for which the EU must anticipate and plan. After that, we will move on to Dr. NACROUR, who is an international speaker and lecturer on Mediterranean geopolitics, as well as commentator and policy advisor. Before retiring from his post as French diplomat in 2017, his last posting was as head of the delegation of the EU to Syria on secondment to the European External Action Service. Within the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he served on bilateral missions in Yemen, Jerusalem, Algeria, United Kingdom, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United States. He was also seconded to the office of the Quartet representative for the Middle East peace process between 2007 and 2010. Last but not least, we have with us Professor TAMIRACE FAKHOURY, who is an associate professor of political science and international affairs in the Department of Social Sciences at the Lebanese American University, and she's also the director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution. TAMIRACE's expertise and core research and publication areas include power sharing in divided societies, Euro-Mediterranean migration dynamics and governance, refugee politics in the Middle East, and the role of migrant communities and diasporas in democratization and conflict transformation. Last but not least, Dr. Daniela Huber, who is with us, and C and EI together, they are the ones organizing this webinar in the framework of EUMENIA. Dr. Huber is the head of the Mediterranean Middle East program at the Institute of Art Internationale, and she's also the editor of the International Spectator. She's also an adjunct professor at Roma Tre University, where she teaches courses on international politics. She has led several EU-funded Horizon 2020 projects, such as, for example, MedReset. And her research includes IR theories and methodologies, as well as contemporary politics in the Middle East and EU and US foreign policy towards and their role in conflicts in the Middle East. Daniela will be our discussant for today. Each speaker will have at his or her disposal around 15 minutes, and then we will start on with a discussion. I guess everyone is already familiar with the rules of the game, so please make sure that your microphones are muted to avoid any possible disruption. And if you have questions, please write them in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat and pass them to our speakers. Thank you for your patience with this quite long introduction to EUMENIA, to our topic, and to our speakers. I think I'll leave it here for now. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll give the floor to YEZID just to set the scene for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Dimitri, and thanks to you and our IAI hosts for putting this together. The first and most important thing to say about Syria is that Syria overall, plus the regime, the government, currently experience an unprecedented level of fragility, and the challenges facing them are more complex than ever. And these are the real sort of signposts of Syria going forward: fragility, complexity, and unpredictability. In fact, it appears that the post-big war situation, if that's an appropriate term, is in fact more difficult to predict now than at any time in the past 8 years of conflict. The government has moved into an entirely new phase, which is sort of war and peace and no war and no peace, that is posing quite extraordinary challenges. And whether that's a moment of opportunity for external actors, especially the European Union, seeking to revive some sort of political process, or whether this actually makes it even harder than ever before to have responsible actors on all sides that can engage and deliver, is really very open. The second thing I want to emphasize is that the regional context is evolving in ways that are potentially making the situation in Syria even more fragile, more complex, but that also this poses an extra challenge for external actors, because neighboring countries are undergoing parallel crises as well. And you have only to look at the interaction, the very direct relationship between the financial collapse of Lebanon, of the Lebanese lira, and of the Syrian lira, as you know, for an example of exactly how the two countries are directly impacted by the same set of developments. And so there are both knock-on effects, but there is actually a risk of a mutually reinforcing spiral, so that the EU will have to think not only about what to do with Syria, what to do with the potential, for instance, for famine, which UN officials have been warning of, but also that this could become actually a package crisis as Lebanon, at least, goes into a very serious socioeconomic crisis, and where at least some parts of Iraq do the same. Third, obviously then the question is, so what kind of external leverage could there be in the situation? Could it be that the current crisis will finally push the Syrian regime entirely against its will to engage in a more meaningful and serious way with political process? Could it actually be pushed into some kind of transition? Until last year, at least, in private, EU officials spoke of a 25-year time frame for their thinking about Syria. Is this all changing? Are developments on the ground in Syria maybe moving that time frame forward, accelerating it? But accelerating it in what direction exactly? Ironically, if there is no central state with competence and control in Damascus, then dealing with Syria could become even more complex. And where operating via third parties such as Turkey, or maybe the United Arab Emirates again, or others, enters into a new set of alignments and of priorities. So let me flesh out some of that a little bit. First, in terms of the general context, it's been clear since the outset, and by the outset I'm thinking of the time around, say, autumn 2018, when Russia, Turkey, and Iran agreed the Sochi agreement and the de-escalation agreement for Idlib. And we entered a new phase where clearly Russia and Turkey were the primary actors in at least the north and northwest. This hasn't been entirely stable or peaceful, as you all know, but in a sense, for the first time, Syria, the Syrian battlefield stabilized. Since then, we've had more or less well-known, well-defined front lines. There's been movement, such as after the Turkish operation in the north, around Ain Arab, Ras Al Ain, Kobani. But beyond that, the front lines have become more or less known. Since then, however, the regime of President Bashar al-Assad has struggled very visibly to take advantage of its physical control and of retaking territory in areas like Deir el-Zor or the south of the country or parts of Idlib in order to restore meaningful government authority. And this is partly because it simply lacks the resources, not only the financial resources, but also the human resources. It's been unable, especially in the south of the country, this is very visible, to deploy internal security cadre, the kind of men who had the experience and the know-how and the local knowledge, who in the past pacified these areas and controlled them. The regime has run out of people like that. It's run out of troops. It's also run out of course, finances, and therefore has devolved and delegated much of its governmental control or its governmental role to other actors, including ex-rebel fighters, including Russian supported formations, and basically has chosen a mode of control which is in effect no control. Rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding markets that function, all this is basically happening in the breach, in the absence rather than in the actuality. Moreover, government policy making is clearly very dysfunctional. Government directives change frequently. The central bank appears to have given up any attempt to restore the Syrian lira or to restore order to currency markets, and has issued various and at times contradictory signals or measures. And clearly, of course, behind all this, we have Western sanctions, including the recent US Caesar Act sanctions that have been tightened, and which are immediately having further knock-on effects for Syria, but also for neighbors, especially in Lebanon. So the Assad regime faces a situation of unprecedented risk and danger, one which neither Iran nor Russia are able to help against, because while they are best able to help on the military front, they are not really able or visibly willing to support either the Syrian budget or the Syrian currency, or to invest in reconstruction capital or funds and so on. So it looks like, if we simply take that as our starting point, as if the regime is truly running out of all options and is going bankrupt in the financial, in the human resources, as well as in the moral and political sense. Now, having said that, I want to step back a little bit and look at, zoom in a little bit on the security dimension and also on the economic dimension, and pick out just a few key characteristics of the regime's response. One of the things that the regime has done very visibly is to focus on security. And this is its fallback option, its default option, and one of the tragedies of Syria, of course, but also one of the real Achilles heels for the regime is that rather than revise its approach to dealing with its domestic politics, to dealing with challenges at home, it is trying to revive its long-standing security response, which means to reimpose conscription as a means of co-opting and taming young men in rebel areas or former rebel areas. It seeks to mobilize these men, former rebels, into the armed forces, to send them to various fronts. In other words, it continues to resort to a military and security approach, which includes militarizing the Alawi community, increasing the portion of Alawis in the officer corps to unprecedented levels, and basically keeping the community mobilized and militarized. This is, in a sense, its sole response to the crisis it faces. It seems to have lost all other levers and is fundamentally unwilling to engage politically, even on its own terms, within its own audiences, with its own loyalist constituencies. It appears very visibly unwilling to reform in any way or engage in any meaningful discussion with anyone who does not start from an assumption of complete obedience and acceptance of the regime, which of course means that any further discussion becomes pretty much meaningless. So in a way, the weakness of the regime is that it prioritizes its security response above all others. It spends much of its time and energy trying to reassert control within the armed forces and the security services. Excuse me. And we've witnessed a wave of reshuffles and transfers, promotions, dismissals of senior officers, which interestingly seem most designed to reassert Bashar al-Assad's personal control and to take back some of the control that has been ceded in the past to Russia and Iran in these different agencies. So again, emphasizing that for the regime, the primary focus is securing control over the armed forces and the security agencies as the entry point to anything else. And this is a problem that is highlighted by the regime's inability to diffuse some of the security threats by offering material trade-offs, economic, financial, subsidies, investment, assistance for reconstruction, better compensation and pensions, etc., as a means both of addressing not simply public distrust in opposition areas or former opposition areas, but actually of addressing loyalist dissent and unhappiness. So all regimes, even the most totalitarian regimes, understand something very basic, which is that physical repression is always more costly than seeking to co-opt society and getting its compliance through non-physical means. This regime has denied itself the means of reducing the physical and financial cost on itself by engaging in either market and economic reforms of various kinds, or most importantly, political reforms. I'll move on to the economic dimension now. And to emphasize, firstly, of course, I'll say one word about this, that the scale of damage and destruction to the economy, let alone to human life in Syria, is enormous. In 2019, the World Bank described the situation as the scale of disorganization and dislocation and destruction as a scale more common in interstate wars than civil conflicts. And the same study assessed that it could take Syria at least 22 years to reach its pre-conflict levels of gross domestic product. Now, moving into some of the interesting patterns and trends, the regime is not simply dealing with the crisis of finances, of capital, that it can't raise revenue for the government, nor bring money into the country. Obviously with sanctions, but also with global conditions, especially with COVID, the ability of the diaspora to send in remittances or other forms of aid, which have been quite significant in providing disposable income, but also in providing some support for the Syrian pound. This has been drying up, as it has for Lebanon and, of course, many other countries. But what the regime has done in response has been to try and assert even greater control over what remains. And what this means is that some of the less visible, less tangible destruction to the economy is not being recognized or addressed. And here I'm thinking of what is known as economic disorganization. In other words, where commercial families, for instance, that in past decades had built significant regional and international trade networks that fed into Syria's private sector and export capacity, quite importantly, these are all gone. They've disappeared and they're not being replaced. Skilled labor has disappeared. Both the private sector, what remains of it in Syria, and the public sector, industry, but also administration, are unable to find the kind of skilled labor in different fields that they need to do anything. These are kinds of losses that aren't going to be restored even if the capital is found. And yet the regime, again, has been unwilling to undertake the kinds of reforms or measures that might reopen credit lines, revive trade and production, reactivate markets, and enhance social acceptance, which I think is a critical aspect again. And what it's doing is what a colleague of mine, Khadr Khabdour, has called a band-aid approach. In other words, to look for a mixture of humanitarian assistance going into the NGO sector or to various communities, the indirect consequences or benefits of informal and formal trade with Turkey via opposition areas, anything that will alleviate some of the burden or provide other forms of income or of inflow of material goods and so on. Selling real estate, mortgaging future sales of phosphates, etc., against Russian investment or Iranian investment. They're trying everything they can so as to have a bit of a patchwork of an economy. Now, I want to start wrapping up so as to allow more time for everyone else and for discussion. What I'll say in wrapping up is two things. First is that to some degree, although Syria's situation seems desperate, the regime's situation seems extreme, there are echoes of Iraq under sanctions between 1990 and 2003, or even of Libya during Muammar al-Gaddafi's period, when Libya also was under severe sanctions. These authoritarian regimes don't fall as easily as we expect. The fact that society is impoverished, that you have 80% of people in poverty in Syria, that access to food or other services is minimal, these conditions do not necessarily translate into the regime weakening or losing its grip, partly because a regime that has access to, say, $100 million finds that the $100 million today are worth literally 6 times what they were in January in terms of translating that into Syrian lira with which to pay civil servants. This doesn't help the civil servants much, but it does mean that those with actual access to any kind of hard currency, and this applies to, say, the warlords in Lebanon who became political leaders and who still retain massive dollar deposits, even as their national currencies collapse, this doesn't necessarily mean they collapse. And so this is a regime that has always managed to operate through networks. It's a network-centric power structure, and it is able to survive under conditions that other governments can't. So I just wanted to underline that let's be very careful about anticipating that the sort of thing I used to hear in 2012, that the regime can't survive, it must collapse. And people would trot out, they'd point to the number of defections or point to the Syrian lira or whatever. All these are really important, really powerful factors, this doesn't necessarily tell us the regime is going to collapse or that it's going to become more willing to negotiate or to discuss politically. The question really is for all of us whether that can become the true Achilles heel of the regime finally. Its unwillingness and its inability to engage in a meaningful political dialogue with any counterpart, including its own loyalist constituencies and its other allies, as well as its adversaries. The real challenge for the EU, ultimately, however, is does this give leverage? To be honest, I don't think so. The real challenge then is if Syria collapses further and if neighboring countries, especially Lebanon, but potentially with knock-on effects in Jordan, which is now facing the Israeli annexation plan for the West Bank, which will cause immense strains in the kingdom, and of course Iraq's ongoing chronic situation. The EU has to think about Syria within this wider package. What levers does it have to address any of this? I'm not frankly sure. I wouldn't know what to advise, and this is why I've only laid out the context and will leave it to, I hope, Anis and TAMIRACE and Daniela to enlighten us further.
Thank you so much, YEZID. I cannot think of a better way. I don't know how you managed to do this in 20 minutes, to lay down all the details on the ground. And you started by talking about fragility, complexity, and unpredictability. And I think you managed to summarize extremely well in just 20 minutes what's the situation on the ground. And I'll give the floor to TAMIRACE, who will talk to us about the situation of Syrian refugees and the EU's politics of refugee resilience as well. And I hope that we will manage in the meantime to solve the problem with Anis's connection and that we will have him after TAMIRACE. TAMIRACE, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to talk about Syrian displacement in Lebanon, so I will shift a little bit the topic. But still, it's a very important component of Syria's protracted conflict. So as we all know, one of the major spillovers of Syria's conflict has been the protracted displacement of more than 6 million Syrians to neighboring countries, mainly Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So in my short presentation, I will briefly talk about the case of Syrian displacement in Lebanon. I will also talk about Lebanon's government's cooperation with the EU on that front and its implications for Syrian refugee rights. And I will mention the key challenges and dilemmas that have impacted coordination in that regard. So to set the context very briefly, as we all remember, in 2015, the EU revamped its neighborhood policy with Middle Eastern states, calling for an approach that relies on tailor-made engagement rather than one-size-fits-all. And instead of stressing democracy deepening, what it initially wanted to do as the Arab Spring started, the revised policy in 2015 focuses on stabilization, resilience, and security as core priorities of this revamped politics. So that same year, with the arrival of more than 1 million Syrians to Europe, we have seen the EU devise new partnership frameworks with neighboring states that have hosted displaced Syrians. So one of these partnerships pillars is to design comprehensive partnerships that try to leverage the EU's funding power and policies in sectors such as development and trade, with a view to branding them as positive incentives in migration management. So more concretely, the EU has attempted to provide incentives such as trade facilitation schemes and financial arrangements so as to encourage host states such as Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan to improve refugee inclusion in their societies and labor markets. So while the EU claims that these refugee tools strengthen the capacity of local refugee protection regimes and foster the resilience of refugees as close as possible to Syria, we all know that they have been harshly criticized because they offer avenues to discourage the potential departure of asylum seekers to Europe. So against this backdrop, I will now move on to Lebanon. So as you know, Lebanon has been a key site for widespread displacement from Syria since 2011, and the EU has been really the main funding power that has provided refugee aid since then. We all know that the country is no signatory to the 1951 convention, yet it still has hosted more than 1 million Syrian refugees. So there is a paradox here, a paradox that Lama Murad, for instance, calls, open borders, but local closures. So how can we explain this? So some background on its politics of refugee reception. At the beginning of the conflict, Lebanon has adopted an open border policy. Soon, however, this policy gave way to a securitized approach of refugee containment. As we know, in 2015, Lebanon closed its borders and asked the UNHCR to stop registering refugees. So in the last years, we have seen an acute political securitization of the refugee question, which has had enormous consequences for the rights of displaced Syrians in Lebanon. So politicians have started portraying refugees as security threats and mostly political threats to Lebanon's so-called sectarian power-sharing arrangements. And very important to our discussion today is that as soon as the balance of power tipped in the favor of the Bashar al-Assad regime around by 2017, various political parties have been vociferously lobbying nationally, regionally, and internationally for Syrian refugee return, stressing Lebanon's overstretched capacity. In fact, 1 year before Lebanon's October uprising that started in 2019, the Lebanese government had started promoting very harsh policies that have significantly restricted Syrians' access to housing, employment, and residency. And as some of you might know, in coordination with the Syrian government, the Lebanese government has moreover been processing applications for return. So against this backdrop, what do we know about the EU's refugee diplomacy approach in Lebanon? And what are its consequences for displaced Syrians? So 9 years since the onset of Syria's war, we can safely say that the EU's refugee approach, which seeks to entice Lebanon to facilitate refugee inclusion and foster resilience, has been gradually overshadowed or eclipsed by Lebanon's shifting policy imperatives and its so-called politics of no asylum. It is true that the EU was able to create a temporary conversation on improving refugee rights. Let me give you some examples. However, this conversation didn't last long. It was very fleeting. So if we go back to 2016, 2016 was the year of euphoria, let's say, to refugee humanitarianism. So if you remember, in the wake of the 2016 London conference for supporting Syria and the region, Lebanon and the EU adopted the so-called compacts, which promised funding in return for the Lebanese government easing Syrians' temporary stay and facilitating their integration in Lebanon's labor market. Back then, the Lebanese government was promised large-scale concessional grants and loans, and it pledged to deliver on some of its reforms. I'll give you some examples. For instance, in 2017, it announced its decision to waive the $200 refugee residency fee, enabling Syrian refugees to renew their legal stay. Very significant, it also adopted measures allowing Syrian parents to register the birth of their children born in Lebanon. That was impossible previously. It also pledged to facilitate Syrian refugees' access to work in some limited sectors. And in the subsequent Brussels conferences on supporting Syria and the region that were co-hosted by the EU, the conversation on improving refugee rights in Lebanon continued, albeit with little success. In reality, measuring whether Lebanon's pledges to the EU have materialized has turned out to be, an impossible task. For example, in its latest Wazir assessment or vulnerability assessment, the UNHCR reports that more than 70% of surveyed Syrians do not have legal status. So the Lebanese government has really attributed such unmet goals or pledges to its overstretched capacity. In reality, as we know, analysts always refer to Lebanon's deliberate intent to maintain legal ambiguity as a desired policy. In yet another perspective, the EU's refugee diplomacy with Lebanon remained largely disconnected from an understanding of Lebanon's polarized perceptions and divisive historical legacies over the Syrian conflict. And allow me to explain here a little bit. Since the onset of Syria's war, Lebanon, as you know, has not developed a unified policy stance either towards the Syrian conflict or towards the refugee issue. Some Lebanese factions have backed the Syrian regime in the face of its rivals, both discursively and militarily. Others have viewed the conflict as an opportunity to weaken Syria's control and long-standing guardianship on Lebanon. Furthermore, the issue of Syrian refugee stay and return has become part and parcel of Lebanese politicians' geostrategic interests. So some political executives who are allies of the Syrian regime hoped that by advocating and pushing for Syrian refugee return, they would contribute to rehabilitating internationally the legitimacy of the Syrian regime. So in this context, as I show in some of my writings, the EU's external approach has become inevitably embroiled in the complex geopolitics of Lebanese-Syrian relations, and some of its policy templates at the end of the day have remained mere ink on paper, nothing more than declarations of intent. For instance, the EU tried to negotiate a trade facilitation scheme with Lebanon in return for its formal integration of Syrian refugees in the labor market. However, Lebanon has perceived this as a political liability or a political suicide. And according to the government, Syrians have already been integrated in Lebanon's informal economy since 1992, i.e. since the end of Lebanon's civil war. In addition to this mismatch between the EU's approach and Lebanon's realities, we also notice that the EU's refugee diplomacy has become a matter of leverage and friction within Lebanon's policy spheres. And examples abound. For instance, some officials in Lebanon have leveraged EU concerns over uncontrolled flows to the European continent, warning the EU that refugees' conditions in Lebanon would only prompt new arrivals to Europe and aggravate its so-called refugee crisis. Of course, the intent was to lobby for refugee return. And as I noted earlier, political factions have intensified their calls for expedited return. So in turn, the EU has opposed this stance and has called for voluntary repatriation only when conditions in Syria become favorable. So in the last 2 years, we have seen clashes between EU officials and their Lebanese counterparts. So what the EU has proposed in return is really supporting Lebanon's resilience as a solution. And we have seen on numerous occasions Lebanese officials challenge this stance, calling on the international community, including in the EU, to secure a gradual return to the stable areas in Syria and to dissociate the return of Syrians from the prospect of a political settlement in Syria. Additionally, some Lebanese politicians have started lately calling on the EU to divert its funds from Lebanon to Syria in the hope of incentivizing refugees to go home. But the EU's, of course, formal position remains the same. So what I wanted to say is that these frictional logics or norms are not only rhetorical, they have had huge consequences for refugees' lived realities and rights. Most importantly, policy divergences have constructed a kind of a crisis governance imaginary that has privileged quick fixes or solutions that haven't been really harmonized with local contexts. Interestingly enough, the one silver lining is that Lebanon's October uprising, or the protest movement that started in 2019, has to a great extent shattered the myth that Syrian refugees are to be held for Lebanon's collapse. So as you know, this protest movement, which started in the wake of a proposed WhatsApp tax, has been calling for overthrowing Lebanon's political leaders and has really discredited its sectarian-based model of politics, which promotes corruption and inept governance. Of course, refugees have not participated in Lebanon's protest because, many do not have legal status, as I said, and they could not afford to be arrested. Though they were at the margins, protesters adopted their cause as a key framing in their graffiti and in their protest performances, and activists criticized the Lebanese state's practices that exacerbated xenophobia and hostility. And they also discredited the key politicians who have been calling for Syrian return. So the very fact that Lebanon's protest highlighted intersectional struggles, embracing various social causes, ranging from workers' rights to refugees' rights, this has helped to discredit the political narrative of the refugee or of the Syrian refugee as a liability, shifting rather the gaze to Lebanon's political regime and to the public looting of funds as the key threats to popular well-being. Notwithstanding this, violence against refugees still manifests itself in various ways, and it takes various forms, be they rhetorical, institutional, and physical forms. So in my opinion, what is to be feared is the continuous deployment of a governance rhetoric that uses refugees as trump cards internationally to distract attention away from the real reasons behind the country's collapse, i.e. looted public funds and corruption. In the last month, when addressing the international community and the EU, some key politicians have recurrently referred to the refugee issue and the lacking support of the international community in burden sharing as factors that have precipitated Lebanon's economic crisis. So shifting the blame away by instrumentalizing Syrian displacement is an important tactic that the Lebanese political regime intends to maintain. Moreover, in the last month, we have seen a rise in tensions between refugee and host communities, especially in localities that have witnessed new forms of extreme poverty. Tensions over the use of water, housing, electricity, food have already been reported in many districts. Organizations providing refugee aid and protection in Lebanon are aware that with Lebanon's economic crisis, that they have to revamp their refugee aid approach in Lebanon, in the sense that focusing only on Syrian refugees is only going to incite tensions on the ground, especially as YEZID said, the Lebanese pound has lost more than 80% of its value, and this only this month. So the collapse is just happening by the day. And according to the Ministry of Social Affairs in Lebanon, 50% of Lebanese citizens have been pushed into poverty. So back in 2019, as the protest had started, the UNHCR had already expressed its awareness of the fact that back in 2019, the UNHCR said that if it dispenses cash assistance through the form of US dollars to Syrian refugees, this is only going to provoke violence on the ground because Lebanese cannot access US dollars. And the EU, in that regard, has already adjusted some funding priorities to cater to this landscape of poverty and vulnerability that both refugees and Lebanese are suffering from. And it has acknowledged the impact of Lebanon's overlapping crises, i.e. its financial crisis and the pandemic. Therefore, I would say that the policy approaches that organizations such as the EU are set to develop in the next month regarding Syrian refugees can have tremendous implications for, I would say, managing this coexistence, this very fragile and precarious coexistence between host and refugee communities. Unfortunately, the landscape does not look so promising. I would like to end with some reflections and observations. As I said, with the outbreak of the pandemic, economic livelihoods are deteriorating by the day. And as YEZID has said, unpredictability has also become part of Lebanon's political, security, and economic landscape. And refugees have been thrown into more vulnerability. They also live in a state of limbo regarding their access to healthcare and hospitals in the context of COVID-19, and they rely to that either on their meager savings, their own safety nets, or on aid agencies. Even before the outbreak of the pandemic, signs of dissatisfaction or simmering rebellion, amongst Syrian refugees have already been visible. So I would like to, mention an event which hasn't really been visible, but which is still important, I would say. Back in December 2019, Syrian refugees have started staging a daily sit-in at the UNHCR in the northern city of Tripoli, criticizing shrinking funds, deteriorating livelihoods, but also criticizing the fact that there are limited resettlement options elsewhere. So indeed, many surveys show that about 80% of Syrian refugees in Lebanon are currently thinking of secondary migration or of return to Syria, despite the grim situation in their home country. And just today, I have read that the UNHCR announced that as a result of Lebanon's economic crisis, more than 75% of Syrian refugees have fallen below the extreme poverty line, in contrast to 50% in 2019. So we are really witnessing a vertiginous deterioration in terms of livelihoods. Just to end, what are the implications? What implications does this complex landscape have for the EU's refugee diplomacy in Lebanon in the context of Syria's protracted conflict? I don't have much time to talk about all dilemmas. I just want to mention one. And one important dilemma that I'd like to briefly mention is the EU's cooperation with Lebanon's governing powers in the context of a grassroots movement of contestation that has completely discredited the political establishment. So as I underscored, the EU has developed in the last years an approach of principled pragmatism, favoring the stabilization of Lebanon rather than the rule of law. Still, as the EU has increased its aid by more than 200% since 2012, we have seen Lebanon's civil organizations and activities, asking, what about the EU money? Where did it go? Especially in the context of Lebanon's harrowing financial crisis and the significant deterioration of refugee rights. So in this regard, in the last month, the EU's pragmatic cooperation with the Lebanese government, despite its bad record in the rule of law and accountability to its own citizens, has lately come under fierce criticism. And this is very important to our discussion today, I would say. So on a final note, some arising questions that I would like to pose, though they are not easy to answer. How can the EU build on Lebanon's grassroots protest movement to develop an external policy that is more attuned to citizens and refugees' aspirations? And in addition, how can its funding power yield tangible consequences for improving the livelihoods and rights of both refugee and host communities? Finally, yet importantly, I guess, what are the implications and risks of cooperating with host governments in which social contracts are currently imploding? In Lebanon, we see that the current social contract between the government and Lebanese citizens does not hold anymore. It's falling apart, and unfortunately, displaced Syrians are mired in this complex struggle. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, TAMIRACE. I have a lot of comments and thoughts, but I think that we finally managed to make things work with Anis. So before something starts going wrong, I want to give the floor to him already. Anis, the floor is all yours. You have 15 minutes at your disposal.
Thank you very much for putting up with all these technical problems, and thanks for YEZID and TAMIRACE for the presentation, both they have done. And you see, having been following the Syrian crisis since September 2011, when I arrived there, we all keep saying that EU should, EU must, EU because of the dangers coming and all that. And I would like to remind the audience of the participant of something which they have to bear in mind to understand how difficult it is to move from the lines we have adopted in May 2012. At the time, you had two schools in the EU, or let me go before. Before adopting any common position on diplomacy, you have to have a consensus, it's unanimity, which is very difficult to find. And the first blockage happened in May 2011, when few member states, Britain, France, Germany, Netherlands, were very much into intervening as a following up of what was done in Libya before the same month on Syria. And many of the other countries did not agree with that. They preferred to find a way of discussing with the government or having the UN being the lead in this. And since then, we have not been able to evolve. And I would like to take the last example, which is just the decision of renewing the set of sanctions. It was signed on the 28th of May this year. And we keep on repeating that the basis of the solution of the Syrian crisis is the UN resolution 2254, going back to December 2015, and the Communiqué of Geneva, going back to June 2012, which means that we are still repeating, we EU, I'm saying, when I say we, still repeating things as they are completely disconnected from the ground, from the reality on the ground. At this time, be it in 2015 or be it in 2012, you know, Russians were not as important as they are today. Turkish would not have been as involved as they are today. We did not have the Islamic State. We did not have the migration issues. And then, but we still, the European Union adopt these principles, as the TAMIRACE said earlier on, because there is no way we can reassess what we have done, because there is no consensus today in Europe to see what the result of all the measures we have been taken, what we should do more, less, with who we should talk. For the time being, I don't see, even though in a week time, 2 weeks time, we'll have another summit in Europe, probably Syria now, having the EU is facing much more urgent problems. The COVID is one of them, but again, the intervention of Turkey in Libya, it will have consequences on the migration fluxes, be it in the Mediterranean area or being through Greece and other places. Which means that today, in a way, the Syrian crisis is perceived from Brussels as a secondary issue, not the principal one, though the consequences are major ones, but it's better not to get involved in trying to open up the Pandora box, because you know, we have already the EU member states after September 2015, many of the issues which were handled in common before, every country went back to its own national policies to try to protect itself. Then this has not changed in the past 5 years. And I don't see how or why the leaders, where they're going to meet in Brussels, are going to address this issue, why there are more pressing issues on the table to assess. Another issue too is that the Civil Act now, which was adopted a few weeks ago by the Americans, it has now the secondary effect has on the European member states, which means that whatever move they can do on the sanctions, specifically on one issue, they are not going to be credible toward the Syrian regime if they are going to say we are willing to lift the sanctions if you do something. be it engage more willingly in the political track or in political negotiations. And I must underline that for the time being, there is not such a thing as political negotiations. Because since November last year, after the first meeting of the Constitutional Committee, nothing had happened. Then we keep on talking about the political process, and that's nothing to do with Mr. Pedersen, the UN envoy. It just happened that there is no willingness by the Syrian government to engage on what we can take as a positive step to re-engage in a political dialogue, though critical with the Syrian government. But I think that as long as we don't re-engage, as YEZID said earlier on, I'm not sure today that the regime is willing to engage in political concessions in exchange of what? He knows that we cannot provide, EU cannot provide, because it is divided, EU cannot provide something coherent to encourage him to follow up on this track. And the last point, because my two previous speakers have taken no time, I'd like to open the floor for questions to, is that the Syrian government has adjusted for the past 10 years on all the sanctions measures. The last interview given by Mr. Moualem 2 weeks ago underlined that, first of all, that the Americans have tried to open up in exchange of lifting or not applying the Caesar Act if they decide to, or let's ask the Iranians to withdraw from Syria. And of course, Bashar al-Assad rebuked. He did not want to engage in this line. And the second thing Moualem said, he said that, they have weathered the sanctions. They have been under sanctions since 1979. Americans, Europeans, 2011. They seem to be reluctant to consider that the sanctions are going to be changing the game on the political track. I would like to stop here, and I'll be very happy to hear the comments, questions, and happy to answer too.
Thank you so much, Anis. You still had 5 minutes, but I'm happy you let this 5 minutes for.
I don't want to be too negative.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience with all of us trying to solve the issue. I'm glad that we made things work. I'll give the floor very briefly to Daniela Huber for some comments and discussion. If we can keep it to 2-3 minutes, if possible, that would be great. And then please continue writing your questions in the chat, or if you want, please raise your hand, and I'll monitor everything, and then we can open the floor for discussion. Daniela.
Yeah, I mean, instead of being discussant, I think I limit myself to a question for each speaker, because I also think that we should just open up for questions to the audience. So thanks to all three of you for these excellent presentations. I have for YEZID one question particularly. You said, okay, that it's obvious that the EU will be a key donor and is needed in the reconstruction of Syria. And but this doesn't necessarily mean that the EU will actually have leverage over the regime. Obviously, it also rejects the regime. So, but what about Russia? I mean, I think Russia has obviously an interest, I guess, to involve the European Union's money in the reconstruction of Syria. So my question would be, how should the EU play this towards Russia? And I mean, I also remember 3 years ago when I was in Moscow that actually the Russians themselves were speaking about a transition, about a political transition. So what is your assessment where this stands now, and how the EU could come in that respect? To Anis, I have a similar question, but related to the United States. And here related to, on the one hand, the rhetoric which comes out once and again in a while in Washington on in a way splitting Syria. I mean, it's never said directly, but it speaks about separate geographical entities. So I think this is one thing where the EU needs to signal, and the EU always states it supports the territorial integrity of Syria, of course, but I think this is one area where the EU needs to signal this to its transatlantic partner. And the other area, I think, where the EU really needs to act now is in relations to the Caesars Act. I think this is one of the most ambitious sanctions that I have ever seen, and that on a already totally shattered country. I think this even goes beyond collective punishment in a way. And obviously, if we look at sanctions, if you look at the research that has been done on this barely ever achieves the goal of regime change. So my question is how the EU can actually, move in and provide humanitarian support where it is needed, particularly in respect to what YEZID also pointed out, that famine is on the horizon, really. So it is really a responsibility for the European Union to act in relation to the Caesars Act. And to TAMIRACE, very briefly, what you said about the Lebanese political establishment and how it uses refugees and migration, we could say the same about the European Union's political establishment and how it instrumentalizes, politicizes, securitizes migration. But I won't say anything about this. For me, what I was thinking about, how can the EU make sure it can deliver the humanitarian assistance directly to the civil society space, which you mentioned, where the money doesn't actually arrive on the one hand. So how could it work more effectively directly with the civil society space? And then, of course, also for Syria, how can its humanitarian assistance arrive to the people there?
Thank you so
much. Quite probably in the context of the sanctions. Yeah, sorry, that's it.
Thank you so much, Daniela. I think I'll read some of the questions in the chat so that we can gather them together. The first question is from Laura El Kemali. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your surname correctly. Who is a PhD candidate at the Université Saint Joseph in Beirut and also desk officer at the German embassy in Beirut. She thanks TAMIRACE and she would like to ask you, how do you see the UN Global Compact in 2020 and the attempt by the United Nations to advocate for the complete waiver of the payable resident permit for refugees in Lebanon? So that's one of the questions. There is a second question by Chloe Berger, and I think this question is also for you, TAMIRACE. You mentioned difficulties in delivering humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees in currencies where their Lebanese citizens cannot access in the bank system. How the EU will be able to deliver its assistance in the context of the Caesar Act enforcement without violating this act? And there is also another question from Mathieu, again for TAMIRACE. And the question is about the returns of refugees from Lebanon to Syria. Is it really happening? Mathieu is representing the Polish association Domus Orientalis, and they're implementing some projects with the church in Syria, mostly in Aleppo. He remembers when he was in Syria in 2018 and heard about reconciliation process implemented and forced mostly by Russia. He says that one of the part of those agreements were returnings of refugees to Syria. From what he can see when he's in Syria, this doesn't work at all, and he thanks you for your attention. There are more questions, but I think I'll leave it here, and I will return to all of you to respond to Daniela's and the rest of the questions, and then I will come back to the questions from the audience. YEZID, shall we start with you?
Yes, thanks. Frankly, I don't think anything really has changed or will change with regard to the core of the question, which is, the timing, if you like, and pacing of EU involvement in reconstruction or Russian contribution to that process. Russia, I think, has always wanted a political settlement. I mean, from the early days of the conflict, they wanted a particular kind of settlement that Western governments at that time were totally unwilling to envisage, and that the Assad regime was unwilling to envisage. And Russia remains in that position where they'd like to use the leverage they have over Assad to push him, nudge him towards some sort of more meaningful political process. The problem is that Russia lacks the leverage to force him to do that. They're not going to risk breaking the regime in order to make it play politically. So they end up basically actually giving into the regime. And that's the irony, that Russia has never been able to use its leverage vis-a-vis the regime, because the regime says basically, you've invested in us, you don't want the other side to win, you're just going to have to keep dealing with us. And so I don't think Russia is going to deliver something beyond what they've tried in the past. And I think that any Western policy that starts from an assumption that if only the Russians would do this or do that, and if only the Russians would understand it's in their interest to get Assad to play ball, it's just shifting the responsibility to another actor that is actually not able to deliver. Going back to the EU for a moment, I mean, the EU is in a position where it can take a principled stand, which is we will not fund this regime in the absence of a meaningful political settlement. And I think that's a valid position and one that should be maintained, frankly, while recognizing the immense human suffering and the immense need inside Syria. The EU has been able to try and play on both sides, as it were, by maintaining humanitarian assistance, which officially has to go through Syrian government designated or approved organizations inside Syria, which therefore allows the regime or various agencies to benefit indirectly, if not directly. I think that's been a reasonable and unavoidable cost of providing assistance inside Syria. However, the scope for EU assistance to liberated zones, non-governmental actors that escape all regime control or interference, that has shrunk immeasurably, especially since part of the remaining liberated area is in fact controlled by Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib, which the EU won't work with. And now with the Caesar Act, it becomes even harder, even for legitimate businesses, NGOs, humanitarians, to work with anyone inside Syria. The risk of being inadvertently somehow in support of the regime has become much higher than ever before, and means that most of these actors are now playing even safer than before. All of this actually limits the scope for EU assistance of any kind under the old rules, let's say. So, but I think what I was trying to say during my presentation is in a way that the situation in Syria is going beyond everything we've dealt with in the past. And it's sort of like saying, how do you help the Iraqi people under Saddam Hussein during the sanctions regime, or the Libyans under Muammar al-Qaddafi? No one ever had an answer for that. And I don't think the EU has an answer for this. And if we start seeing famine conditions or significant collapse, if regime control in the south of the country disappears, and you're left with something which is somewhere between Russian and Iranian control through their proxy militias, all these are actually now possible. In the north, you say, well, Turkey can take over, and the Turks are doing a reasonably good job of it. I mean, by allowing the Turkish lira to be used, by funding local government, funding services, electricity, schooling, universities, the postal service, etc. But that's because Turkey's doing this. The EU can sort of sit back and allow others to do this. Does the EU have the means to deal with a collapse scenario? Well, I think no. Put troops on the ground, well, that's not going to happen. Provide money conditionally, well, the conditions won't work. And so on and so forth. So, the 25-year vista I mentioned earlier that EU officials apparently think in terms of, whether it's 25 years, 15 years is not the point. The point is, I think the EU has parked itself in a position where it will not, understandably, and cannot also understandably do much more.
Thank you, YEZID. Anis?
Yeah, if I may, just two little questions. The answer to the questions of Daniela is the division of areas. As you know, it comes all the time. It has been since the beginning, where you had people going back with the idea of dividing Alawite states and dividing Syria. But this is something which is not today in the narrative of EU, because in the EU on the 2254 resolution, it always says that Syria has to maintain its integrity. Any solution has to take this. Then what we are hearing from the states once in a while, that we can divide, we can have the Kurds control the oil in the northern part and control some of the areas in the south too by proxies too. This is not going to help this overall solution. For the time being, there are no negotiations for an overall solution. Then anyone can improvise and can project his fantasies on what the solution can be. But for as long as there are no negotiation under the UN, I think that there is nobody who can anticipate what this is going to be. And for the time being, there is no appetite on the regime side to engage in meaningful negotiations. As for the sanctions, yes, for sure, the Caesar Act is going to complicate much more all what the EU is providing through NGOs on different channels, even from Turkey, even from Lebanon. Now it's going to mean that those who used to be the go-between the EU and the refugees, or on the projects on the ground, they are going to be much more careful and scared that something will completely block all the possible cooperation in other areas too, because of the secondary effect of the Caesar Act. Then on both sides, I don't see how the EU can move. As I started by saying that the EU is divided and it remains divided, there is no incentive for them to start trying to find out, at least what have we done in the past 10 years, how can we improve, and what we could do next. It's like if the EU today has forbidden itself to be prospective in its analysis, looking backwards on what they've done and seeing how things can be done in the future in a better way. While I agree with what TAMIRACE said and YEZID said, that the risk is famine, hungry people, and more refugees, be it through Turkey or any way else, through the Mediterranean area now. The Turks have an advantage to play this, because they are more and more present, and it's a facilitation for them to, let's say, use the refugee and the migration card as a pressure on the EU on other topics.
Thank you, Anis. TAMIRACE, and there are more questions waiting for you as well in the chat, but if you can tackle this in 3 minutes, then we will be able to tackle the rest as well.
Okay, I will be very brief, and if someone wants to continue the conversation online via email or something, I'm happy to elaborate further. So with regards to Daniela's question, I think that right now it's much more than about the EU's aid effectiveness, because the current discussion on unlocking funds for the IMF in Lebanon, the topic of conditionality is back on the table. So how can the international community cooperate to the Lebanese government, while at the same time inducing and catalyzing reforms that make the Lebanese government liable or accountable vis-a-vis these reforms? Because as we've seen also, like dispensing aid to project implementation has not really been that substantial to alleviating the crisis. So I remember Nathalie Champion a few years back in time talked about conditionality in the EU and whether it would promote cooperation or make Middle Eastern states more accountable or less accountable. So I guess what we are seeing now in Lebanon is going to be a fertile terrain for such debates. So I think it could also be a game changer whether Lebanon can actually, for the first time, implement reforms that would, call for more accountability. Yet it seems that prospects on the ground seem rather pessimistic and grim for the moment. I don't want to talk too much about that, but we can continue the conversation, of course. Regarding the Caesar Act, I would like to clarify a few points. First of all, the Caesar Act, as far as I understood, has a clause which calls for exception when it comes to humanitarian work. And today, UNHCR representative in Lebanon, Mireille Girard, has announced that the work of the UNHCR vis-à-vis Syrian refugees will not be theoretically affected because of its clause, the clause of exception. However, we don't know how things will work out on the ground. I don't know, as we speak, as you know, currently the 4th Brussels conference for the support of Syria and the region is taking place, in order to pledge aid for the Syrian refugee challenge and, for Syria's neighboring countries. And just today, Lebanon's Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, has called the international community for shielding Lebanon against the impact of the Caesar Act. So I would like also to remind you that Lebanon has not taken a final unified stance vis-à-vis the Caesar Act. So we don't really know how it's going to impact its foreign politics and its domestic politics. Of course, it would be crazy if Lebanon sides with the call of the Syrian ministers to cooperate on facing the Syrian Act. However, I don't think that this would take place. Lebanon is aware of the repercussions that this might bring about. However, how to navigate this very turbulent situation is the question, because as you know, Lebanon suffers from a dual power and from a dual foreign policy vis-à-vis Syria. For the moment, I would like to say that things are nebulous, and as Dorothée Shea has said, the US ambassador in Lebanon, the Caesar Act is not expected to become a collective punishment against everyone, but on the ground, of course, it's going to be instrumentalized, and as Anis said, it's going to make things very difficult and very politicized on the ground, and it's going, of course, to lead to further polarization and politicization of the situation. Last but not least, regarding Syrian refugee returns, yes, they are happening. According to the Lebanese government, more than 170,000 Syrian refugees have returned. The UNHCR says that only 34,000 have returned. So statistics are not reliable. The crazy thing is that not only the Lebanese government is cooperating with the Syrian government to process applications for return, but also some Lebanese political parties have taken the initiative to process applications and have opened refugee return offices. I have just published an article in Third World Quarterly talking about that if someone is interested in following up on the conversation. I will stop here, and I'm sorry if I haven't answered all questions. I guess you can always continue online and via email.
Thank you, TAMIRACE. I'll pose the last 3 questions just because we started late as well. If everyone has 5 more minutes and if it's fine with our speakers, I will pose the last 3 questions. First question is from Afik, who is a bachelor student from Malaysia. He says that he has witnessed and seen refugees arriving in Malaysia, and they are accepted there and also allowed to work and live their lives freely. Malaysia, however, is not a signatory to UN's key refugee treaties, and there is no law to protect them. Now that they are being urged back by Assad to come home just to be welcomed with arrest and interrogation. What do you suggest the EU's approach to settle this to protect the refugees? And it's an open question, and any of the 3 of you can respond to this if you wish. The second question is from Beste Ishleyen. It's a question for TAMIRACE. You talked about potential tension between citizens and migrants. Are there also tensions between refugees of previous decades and the newcomers, for example, in terms of access to the labor market? And the last question is from Andrea Baldi. What is the role of the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean in the Syrian crisis? And I think maybe Anis could respond to this, but I'll leave it up to you which question you would like to respond. So let's start the same way with YEZID first.
I don't really have anything to add. I'd like to actually hear what my colleagues have to say.
Okay, thank you, Yazid. Anis?
Okay, about the last question about the parliamentary role, you know, be it the EU or be it the Parliamentary Association of the Mediterranean Union for the FEM, Syria is not very high on the agenda. They raise the question, it's like if, you know, it's a game planned beforehand. They raise the question, they have an answer, and everyone has played his role, and that's it. It doesn't go any further, and not many people pay attention, regrettably, to what is said in these forums. But as for the return of the refugees and what the EU can do to protect those who want to go back, it's going to be very difficult to do it as long as we are not back in Syria talking to the regime. I'm not advocating to say that it's business as usual. The dialogue has to be critical. You know, from my experience, all my meetings with officials used to start in a very harsh way. You know, they accused me of being complicit of what the terrorists are doing by imposing sanctions, allowing them to get away with it and all that. And I used to answer that, you know, when they allow the humanitarian access to go through to the areas under control of the rebels or areas not under control of the Syrian government, it was not a generous act that we're doing, just applying the international humanitarian law. And but that, you know, through this sort of difficult conversation at the beginning, slowly you can move to something else. Of course, you're not going to achieve big things, but at least you can ask specific questions on specific individuals of what's going on in a specific area, and at least to be able to transfer or to transmit the information you can get from them to Brussels and to the EU member states capital, to have a real idea of what's going on the ground. You know, again, presented today, we have a chargé d'affaires who goes once in a while to Damascus, again, had meetings. But I think that maybe time has come to have somebody of Brussels headquarters of a higher level with a strong message, coming on a strong message. And the advantage of Mr. Borrell now, he has arrived, now he has been in office for over 6-7 months. And I think maybe, you know, to increase the level of the conversation, because our meetings were with the deputy minister dealing with humanitarian affairs or European affairs, maybe time has come to raise the topic on, you know, specific what are our requests. Because on the other hand, we cannot say we're not going to fund the reconstruction unless there is a political process and expect them that they will have the refugees what they're going to go to. You know, everything is destroyed. Many of the areas where these refugees come from have been disappeared from the map almost. These are the two comments I wanted to make on this.
Thank you so much, Anis. And TAMIRACE?
Yes, so thank you, Afid, your question regarding Syrian refugee return. Of course, the EU has announced its formal position that as long as conditions in Syria are not propitious, Syrians should not return. So this is formally the EU's position. However, on the ground, the EU does not have the power to actually change the situation. And Daniela has alluded to the incoherencies between the EU's internal policy making and external policy making. So as we've seen in the last year, the EU's normative power in inducing reforms or calling, you know, or catalyzing refugee norms has hugely dwindled, especially in its southern neighborhood. So while it maintains this rhetoric and it speaks about dignified, safe return, to my knowledge, it doesn't really have the power to change the constellation. And to best this question, yes, there have been a lot of tensions, especially when it comes to Palestinian refugees from Syria who also came to Lebanon. For instance, the fee waiver that I talked about, the $200 that had to be paid in order for the refugee to renew their legal residency. This was applicable only to Syrian refugees, but not to Palestinian refugees coming from Syria. So there is a very selective implementation of all practices and all laws, and those change by the day. And of course, the asylum regime or the labor regime that governs Palestinian displacement is totally different from the one that governs Syrian displacement. So what we have seen in Lebanon are numerous pathways to precarity and overlapping asylum regimes, given the fact that Lebanon has no coherent refugee politics. Instead, it has an informalized set of refugee practices that change according to geopolitical imperatives, because Palestinian displacement has another historical legacy, is ruled by a different rhetoric. So yes, there are definitely a lot of tensions. And of course, the EU's aid has created tensions also on the ground. I mean, a lot of refugees, according to our field research, questioned why the EU would come up, for instance, with a compact that is only set to cater for Syrian refugee needs. And this has happened also in Jordan, where Egyptians and other refugees felt sidelined and marginalized because of nationalizing those or ethnicizing those refugee pools. Thank you.
Thank you, TAMIRACE. Thank you to all of the 3 and 4 speakers actually for being with us. We really appreciated that you made time to join this webinar. And this might be one of the very few good things with this pandemic, that it would have been very hard to have the 3 of you in the same room, while it was slightly easier to do this online. So a very big thanks from myself, but from all the EUMENIA team as well, to all 3 of you for accepting our invitation and joining us for this conversation. A big thank you to Daniela for her role as a discussant, but also to Natalie Champion and to the Institute of Art Internationale organizing this in the framework of EUMENIA. And a big thanks to all of you for engaging with us and following us. Please make sure, I mean, we organize a lot of activities. Please make sure that you follow us on Twitter and you like our Facebook page, EUMENIA, so that you can stay up to date with all the exciting things we are organizing and that we will be organizing for the next year as well. Thank you all once again, and have a nice evening and stay safe.